Hello, friends. We are going to take a look at post-classical China today, focusing on the dynasties of the Sui, Tang, and Song eras. And as a bit of review and to get us to that point, the last time that we took a look at China was in classical China with the rise of the Qin and Han dynasties. So the Han dynasty collapses around the year 220 CE due to internal issues such as the gap between the rich and the poor growing to a point where peasants began to rebel, which weakened the dynasty, as well as outside invasions such as nomadic groups from the steppe region, such as the Xiongnu. And just like we saw before the rise of the Qin, what happens is that China enters into a warring states period. This warring states period lasts from 220 to 581. And what we see in any warring states period is that there are multiple noble families who are trying to claim the mandate, right? The mandate of heaven. But none of them are strong enough to fully topple the other. This is a time period where even though there is great instability, so much happens in this warring states period that has long-term cultural effects on China. One of those things is, we're going to talk about this later, but in this era, the stories of the warring states families creates standards and these tales come out that later are concentrated in these classic books, such as something called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which becomes a standard in Chinese literature. Economically, prolonged war totally disrupted trade, and specifically the Silk Roads. And as a result, economically, China takes a bit of a hit. Infrastructure is damaged because there's prolonged war and not a central government that's going to raise the taxes consistently and organize labor consistently to work on that. So this is a time period that there's a lot of anxiety. People are very upset. People feel abandoned by both their government as well as whatever religion that they believe in. And that background explains why Buddhism grows in great popularity in the later stages of this warring states period, which it makes perfect sense because Buddhism is a religion that provides a great deal of comfort. We have to remember that the first noble truth of Buddhism says that life is suffering. And that really resonated with people because people were deeply suffering during the warring states period, whether they were losing loved ones in the war or whether they were starving, right, because economically things were so rough. And so what we see in the latter part of this era is a rise not only in conversion, but also in the building of monasteries and Buddhist temples and lots of Buddhist art. And we're going to see that there will be a reaction against this for some pretty key reasons. Right, so I just have a couple examples here of some of the types of art that flourish in this rise of Buddhism in China. So on the top image are the Lungmen meditation caves, which are super cool. And so what we see is these caves were dug out of the side of a mountain. And if you were trying to meditate, if you were part of a monastic tradition, people would go and spend long periods of time in these meditation caves in order to practice their faith and hopefully achieve enlightenment. And the bottom is just one of so many different images that we could look at of Chinese Buddha and Chinese Buddhist monks who are being honored in a temple. So we're going to explore more what this looks like in the backlash that does eventually happen towards Buddhism. But I want you to remember that whenever we have a warring states period, there's usually some really significant things that happen there, even though we're not going to be studying a particular dynastic family and their policies. We don't skip these time periods. We look usually at like cultural growth that happens in times of instability. So just like previously as we studied, there is a pattern in Chinese history. So usually after a prolonged warring states period, the next dynasty that successfully takes hold of the country or the empire is a legalist one. And so that's exactly what happens in this scenario. So the Sui family, and that's how you pronounce that, Sui. The Sui family, who had been fighting other warlording families in China, grows a military strong enough to begin to defeat the other noble families. And the first emperor under the Sui is Yang Jian, who is very similar to Shi Hongdi, who we learned about in the Qin Dynasty. So utilizing legalism, right, extreme rule of law, executing all of his political enemies. And anyone he believed was a dissident had to go. Also relying heavily on forced labor is a way that the Sui dynasty is successful in building up infrastructure, but it's also why they are just as short-lived as the Qin dynasty was, right, only lasting a couple decades, because, similar to the Qin, people were sent to work on building defensive walls. Specifically, the Great Wall needed rebuilding because outside invaders had toppled them. People were forced into the military and sent to expand the empire further into like Central Asia, as well as to Korea. And another project that was started by the Sui, but not finished by the Sui, it's finished by the next two dynasties, is a piece of infrastructure called the Grand Canal. So here in yellow is the Grand Canal, which is still functioning today. And the Grand Canal was really essential in China because, if you'll remember from earlier in the year, Chinese rivers run east-west. And that's great for shipping people and shipping resources on the east-west axis. But it was very important, as China is growing and expanding, to have something that can connect China north-south. And that's exactly what the Grand Canal does. So by having this canal, we can ship goods and people and military forces north and south in order to meet whatever needs are there. So it promotes internal trade. It helps to centralize the empire. So it's an example of infrastructure that's built in this time period that is super important and does help, because we're about to watch as China not only grows, but stays a little more consistent in its transfers of power. And a lot of that has to do with the Grand Canal. But we won't say more about this way because they are very short-lived, and the next two dynasties are more important for our context. So the Tang and the Song dynasties are the next two that we're going to explore. And even though they are separate dynasties, they're very much continuations. Even though every transition between dynasties does include a war, sometimes they're shorter than others. And so the transition between the Tang and the next dynasty, the Song, was relatively shorter than other transitions. So it allows for a lot of continuity between the two. So the Tang dynasty topples the Sui because they're able to take advantage of the discontent of the peasants and also the disaffected families who were not incorporated into the Sui dynasty and in fact were considered political enemies, and so many people had been executed. So under Tang Taisong, he is able to create a coalition of lots of different forces that topples the Sui dynasty. And just like happened with the Han dynasty, when it followed the Qin, they recognized that while some form of legalism is important to subdue the Sui and any families that are still loyal to them, the Tang and the Song dynasties adopt Confucianism as their overarching political philosophy. And so we see this even in the way that Tang Taisong dealt with some of the conquered territories. So Tang Taisong, pictured here, will conquer Vietnam briefly, Tibet, and Korea. And there are other parts of the world, and we'll talk more in the next slide, parts of the East Asian world that are not fully directly conquered, but instead become these tributary states. So what happens with this is these tributary states, Tang Taisong and other Tang emperors could have conquered them, which would have necessitated using money and resources to do so. But what the Chinese were recognizing around the year like 600, 700 is that they do have vast power. And what they could do instead of conquering is set up a tributary relationship in which they could promise that they would not remove some of the leaders of the places that they were influencing. So you could keep your king, your emperor, your, whatever terminology is in place for their political governance. So you could technically remain independent, and it's quite technical. But to prevent China from invading, you would have to send tribute to China in the form of taxes, goods, something like that. And so the relationship that is established is that China promises not to invade, but in fact also promises to use their military to protect their tributary states in exchange for taxes and other forms of loyalty. So I'm going to go here so we can see the expansion of the Tang Dynasty. So over time, these tributary states begin to include sections of like Manchuria, which is kind of nowadays is part of China, but is this northern section I'm circling with the mouse here. Also, parts of Korea and Japan become parts of the tributary state system. And so, like I said, you would have to pay tribute in the form of like taxes and goods to China, but also it would be required that every year or every set of years that some political representative from the tributary state would have to travel to the Tang capital to kowtow to the emperor. And kowtow means a ritual bow that you do to show that you are subservient to someone else. And so this shows that even though they allowed some of the local leaders to keep their seat of power, at the end of the day, it's China that was in power because these other people are bowing to them, right, in this really important ritual, as well as all the taxes that are being paid. Another political effect of the Tang Dynasty or moment in the Tang Dynasty we've mentioned before in reference to the Abbasid Empire. So if we look, and this is one of many different estimates of the expanse of the Tang Dynasty, but it's definitely a very funny shape, and then we can talk about, kind of what you see when you look at the Tang Dynasty. Right, but what we do know is that the Tang Dynasty expanded in this really interesting way out west. And by doing so, as they pushed further west, they were pushing further west just as the Abbasid Empire is pushing east. So right here is the Uyghur territory and is the location for the Battle of Talis that we discussed with the Abbasid Empire. And so just to kind of make that context there. And we'll remember that what we talked about is that, yes, this is a moment of conflict, but there are a lot of cultural effects of this interaction. The first is which, Islam comes into far, far, far western China as a result of Abbasid expansion. But also that this war did create exchange between China and the Arabic or the Islamic Empire so that paper technology and mathematics and other scientific developments are diffused in this moment. So it's a pretty big deal. And we'll chat more together about the very interesting decision to only kind of expand in this way, but I do want to develop that in class with you. So let's talk about some of the functions of the Tang Dynasty and how they used infrastructure and certain government and social programs to try to create stability. So first and foremost, in terms of transportation, in the Tang Dynasty, they start to have a way higher number of horses, which is a really big deal, as we know, because horses are the main form of transportation. And so this is going to help fortify the Tang military, which explains how they were able to conquer so much territory. But also they utilized the horses to create a mail system. And so they have this huge, kind of like Chinese Pony Express, which helps to deliver information throughout the empire, just like the Persians did and like so many other parts of the world eventually do. So this is going to help keep the empire more centralized by relaying information about possible rebellions or needs from the empire. Because we'll remember that the Tang and the next dynasty, the Sung, do adopt Confucianism as their political philosophy. And in this Confucian philosophy, the rulers have to take care of their constituency. If they don't, we'll remember that the peasants or anybody has the right to rebel if they are neglected by their government. So gathering this information is really key to that. Another example of a government policy that's key to that is a policy that they call the equal field distribution system. So the equal field distribution system is a super interesting early example of an attempt to redistribute land. So the policy was trying to take some power away from these noble aristocratic families who owned the majority of land in China. And what they wanted to do was get some of that land into the hands of the peasants so the peasants would be happier and be able to meet their needs more. And a big reason for that is that during the Warring States period, those warlord families gobbled up a lot of land that used to be more independently held by the peasantry. So in the Tang Dynasty, what we're looking at is a pretty serious feudal system, right, where landlords own the land, the peasants work on that land, and that can create a lot of tension. The Tang Dynasty does not want the peasants to rise up. So they set a law that said that you can only pass on a fifth of your land to your children or to whoever is inheriting your land. The rest, the 4/5 of the land that remained, would be redistributed by the government to the peasantry. This policy was really popular amongst the peasants, obviously not popular amongst the nobles, and did work for a short period of time until there were some issues. So a couple of the issues that arose, first off, is population growth, right? We'll see that population in China booms in this time period because of certain developments. And so at some point, there kind of isn't enough land. I mean, China's pretty huge. But more importantly, what we start to see is corruption, that some of these later emperors don't adhere to the equal field laws as they should and let things slide, right? They let nobles that they like keep land or even buy back some land. Because at some point, since this system also applied to the peasants, as the peasants began to only be able to pass off a fifth of their land to their children, at some point the peasants had so little land that they were essentially forced to sell that land back to the rich nobles. And so everyone kind of ended up back where they belonged. Another issue is that Buddhist missionaries began to buy up land, and often it would be huge expanses of land where they would build missions, and also they would have a lot of huge farms for the purpose of growing food to feed people out of their Buddhist practice. You know, while some people really liked this because the Buddhist missionaries are ultimately helping people, what you see are a lot of Chinese nobles start to get pretty upset with the Buddhists. They don't really like that the Buddhists have a ton of land, and that land was not subject to the equal field distribution laws because of their religious status. So some people start to become resentful of the Buddhists. They see them as like sitting on land and not doing enough with it. And so tensions arise, and we'll explore more tensions that rise through some kind of activities and some documents later on. So over time, the equal field distribution system fails, right? It falls apart because of those issues. And after that happens, we start to see the gap between the rich and the poor begins to super grow again. The peasantry responds in lots of ways. There are some rebellions. We're also seeing that a lot of the peasantry is moving towards Buddhism because they see the Buddhists as trying to help them, and also because the philosophy is very comforting to them. So a cultural development that happened in response to this is the rise of Neo-Confucianism. And so Neo-Confucianism is a more intensified form of Confucianism. You can think of this as similar as kind of like neoconservatism in American history if you've studied that. The idea of kind of rebranding and intensifying a philosophy that existed earlier in a culture. So, since the Tang Dynasty wanted to fight back the popularity of Buddhism, what they do is they double down on Confucianism, and also there's a philosopher that kind of reinterprets Confucianism in a way where they try to like kind of win people back. So first, we see Neo-Confucianism in the way that the civil service exam not only was utilized by the Tang and Song dynasties. Any Confucian dynasty is going to utilize that civil service exam that we learned about before. But we see the Neo-Confucianism here because what they do is they kind of weave in Neo-Confucianism into the curriculum of the schools that prep you for the exam. But also they intensify the exam. They make it way, way, way harder. So that's one way they do it. There's also other cultural components such as foot binding, which we'll chat about in class, that shows the relationship between men and women in a very physical way to reinforce that cardinal relationship. The other way in which Neo-Confucianism presents itself is through the writings of philosopher Zhu Qi. So Zhu Qi wrote lots of different stuff, but he reimagined Confucianism in a way that tried to appeal to what people needed, right? Because if you think about it, people are fleeing to Buddhism, all right, and they're kind of abandoning Confucianism, especially in the early Tang days and during the previous Warring States period. People felt like Confucianism didn't work, right? If it had worked, the Han Dynasty wouldn't have fallen and stuff like that. So Zhu Qi is trying to weave in more spirituality into Confucianism in order to meet people's needs for spiritual comfort. But they do so in like the most, like, I don't know, Confucian ways. Because remember, Confucianism is pretty secular. And it relies heavily on the concept of the junzi, or the educated gentleman, as they call it. So these are some quotes I pulled from some of the writings of Zhu Qi, where we can see that he's trying to weave in Buddhist philosophies. He's like co-opting some Buddhist philosophies, trying to put them into Confucianism in this way that people didn't really buy. Because I don't know about you, but as I read through these, I don't know if I would like take this up as spiritual practice. Because ultimately what he's saying is that you can find spiritual comfort in education. And while I do kind of believe that in a way, it's a bit of a stretch. Excuse the bell. A bit of a stretch for people when instead they'd rather practice meditation or go to temples of Taoist or Buddhist tradition to feel more comfort. So I'll kind of read through this, and we'll chat about this when we're together. But one of the quotes is, "Read books to observe the intentions of the sages and worthies. Follow the intentions of the sages and worthies to observe natural principle. It's best to take up the books of sages and read them so that you understand their ideas. It's like speaking with them face to face. You must frequently take the words of the sages and pass them before your eyes. Roll them around and around in your mouth and turn them over and over in your mind. In reading a text, you must be full of vigor. Arouse your spirits, keep your body alert, and don't let yourself grow weary. As if a sword were at your back, you must pierce through each passage. Engage your breath as you internalize the words of the sages. Inhale slowly as you read the beginning of the passage. Breathe out as complete the passage." Right? So stuff like that. Right? So he's almost making the sages, right, the authors, into gods, right? It's like you can speak to them, you can pray to them in that one quote. The last two, really kind of like the last three, is almost like trying to weave in meditation as you're studying. So this part of Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism does not really catch on. But the kind of political side and some of the social changes are where we do see it really take root. So let's talk about the fall of the Tang. So the fall of the Tang Dynasty happens because of some financial collapse. There is some disruption along the trade routes. So I'm not going to go back to it just yet, but this happens in the 900s, early 900s. And this is slowly when some of the Turkish groups are beginning to mess with the Silk Roads a little bit. So that's part of it. But the other issue is that the equal field distribution system, amongst other government initiatives, begin to fail. And so peasants are in deep need. So we see waves of peasant rebellions around the year 900 that lead to the collapse of the Tang Dynasty. One example is the Huangchao Rebellion, which is pictured here, and this is a more modern illustration of Huangchao. Huangchao is called the Chinese Robin Hood because while he came from a little bit more of a noble class, he orchestrated peasant rebellions to try to steal from the wealthy and redistribute land and silver and jade and other luxury goods to the poor. So it's a pretty fun story. But he's just one of many rebellions that happens that weakens the Tang and allows the next dynasty to rise to power. But before we get into that, I do want to make note of a very important cultural development in China in this time period, which is the rise of Chinese porcelain. Pretty much every civilization has pottery, right? It's such a simple form of art. It can be complicated, but at its heart, it's a pretty simple form of art. It's very functional, right? Working with mud, making it clay, and then forming it into tools that one can use, right? Whether it's making pots that you can store food in, or amphora to store wine in, or even just like figurines for decoration, or maybe for tombs. But China is going to lead the way in shifting pottery to being something that can be a little bit more kind of rough around the edges or purely functional, to inventing porcelain, which becomes a really important luxury good that's a big driver of Chinese international trade. So I have a couple examples here of what some of the more sophisticated forms of pottery could look like before we get to the Tang whiteware. So in the earlier kind of like Han through the beginning of the Tang Dynasty, the more sophisticated forms of pottery looked a bit like this. So for example, right here, and I should have something for scale, but this is actually a pretty big piece. So in terms of decorative art, the early Tang had developed something called blue glaze, which could be utilized to add color and whatnot. But at this point, both the glazes and even the types of clay they were using were kind of pretty thick. And so the pieces they made were either really big or just not very dainty, which was absolutely fine. But it meant that, the pieces that you make were usually going to be, how do you put this? It's gonna be hard to really ship it. And it didn't have a reputation for being like super fine art. Another example is this terracotta piece right here. And both of these are tomb art coming from the Tang Dynasty, because the tombs, especially of the upper classes, were really elaborate. You would place figurines of, it's kind of like the Egyptians, figurines of people or animals that you would want to have in the realm of the ancestors with you. Right, so here we see the horse, and here we have a camel and a merchant. So you can see I think these are really awesome, but they're not very like fine and sophisticated. The Tang Dynasty, the artisans of the Tang Dynasty developed what's called whiteware towards the end of the Tang era. And whiteware essentially is both a form of clay that's very, very fine, as well as a glazing that also is fine, but helps to strengthen the fired clay piece. So that not only is it small and dainty, but it's kind of strong so that it can withstand shipping, right, over long distances. So this is technically porcelain. So it's a much finer piece of art. And China gets so good at perfecting porcelain that if you think about it, the term China is synonymous with porcelain. Right? I don't know if your family has stuff like that, but if you go to a fancy dinner party or Thanksgiving at grandma's, that's when they use the fine china, right? They call it china just being a term for porcelain plateware. So on top of silk and tea, porcelain is going to be added to the goods the international merchants really want to get their hands on from China. So we're going to keep our eye on that. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Song Dynasty for a little bit. So the Song Dynasty lasts from around mid-900 to essentially the rise of the Mongols, so close to the end of the 1200s. So the Tang had lost territory to Arab expansion, and as we talked about. And so due to the peasant rebellions and other issues in the Tang dynasty, the Sung family rises up to claim the mandate and overthrow the Tang. And the Sung dynasty, though, because it's a pretty quick transition, and that they also adopt Confucianism, I often kind of like conflate the Tang and the Sung. Like to me, they're like continuities. The Song Dynasty isn't showing up and like totally changing the game. And so, because the Tang Dynasty was economically, at least from an international trade standpoint, really strong, and because that they had set forth a really important intellectual tradition, the Song Dynasty can take advantage of that. And the Song Dynasty is often known as like a golden age, even though, as we'll see, they did withstand military occupation by a nomadic group. And usually that doesn't happen. Usually if there's a bunch of invasions happening, art takes a hit. So I think it says a lot about the momentum going into the Song Dynasty that they are able to still innovate artistically and scientifically, even though they were living under a military occupation. And I'll show you a map in just the next slide or two. But there's a group called the Jurchen, who are a steppe nomadic group from the area we know today as Mongolia. And so they push into the Song Dynasty and occupy the northern section. So it pushes the Song Dynasty and the leadership down into the south. So we'll take a look at that. Over time, there are some attempts to innovate the economy. Specifically, the Song Dynasty tries to use paper money. It doesn't work, and it does lead to inflation and eventually economic collapse, which will help us understand the rise of the Mongols later. So these are the maps I was talking about. So if we look here, this is the original territory of the Song Dynasty. So as I said, we could see that they lost that interesting extension that the Tang had going out west. So instead, they're concentrated more into the east. And so when the Jurchen invade around the year like 1100, right, they occupy this northern territory. And so this is known as the Southern Song era. So the Song Dynasty is broken up into the Northern Song era, so it's like 960 to about 1100. And then 1100 to close to 1300 is known as the Southern Song Dynasty. Which was like the government was in hiding from the nomadic groups there. One of the cultural developments that I want to highlight that become popular in the Song era is the rise of the pagoda building or pagoda style roofs. So the pagoda, which you can see this image here, and I'm sure is very familiar to you if you've ever been to East Asia, if you've been to Chinatown even, or watched any TV shows or movies that are set in any East Asian regions, you've seen this type of image. You've seen this type of roof. So the pagoda, the roofs on the pagoda are known as Song-style roofs. But what they are, it's a piece of architecture that is inspired by what's called the Indian stupa. So the Indian stupa is originated from the Hindu and then the Buddhist tradition. So you can see here, stupas often look like this, right, on these Hindu and Buddhist temples. And as Buddhism is growing in popularity in China, the Chinese Buddhists, who sometimes have traveled along the Silk Roads and to India, or vice versa, Indian Buddhists or Indian merchants have traveled to China, and so we're seeing the spread of this cultural. They will adopt the Buddhist structures, but slowly kind of tweak it to have more of a Chinese expression, right? So this is our classic acculturation happening here. And so what stupas do, or why stupas look the way that they do, is that they have many tiers to their structures that honor the elements, right? The 5 elements that came up a lot and when we discussed some of these like medical philosophies. But all these elements of earth, water, fire, wind, and void, or the idea of like ether, are all a big part of how Hinduism, Buddhism, a lot of these other philosophies, which includes Taoism and the concept of qi, how they understand how elements all exist and must be in balance. Right? So these ideas and these structures that start in India make their way to China. China makes it its own through its process of acculturation, and then continues to spread this architectural feature throughout other parts of East Asia. So I would know this as a really good example of both cultural diffusion and acculturation. So a couple other things I want to like throw at you right now, and we can kind of build and talk about some of these things later, is that the era of the Tang and the Song dynasties is an era of so much Chinese innovation. Often people know that China invented most of like the super awesome stuff that like we have in the world, and much of it is coming from this era. So one of these things is the mechanical clock. So China is credited for making the first mechanical clocks, which what we have to remember is that even though they might have been on a small scale, what they're doing is laying the foundations for some key elements of like industrial engineering within a mechanical clock, right? The way that kind of these gears all fit together. They start playing with those with clocks at first, which also are very important, for keeping time for everything from religious ceremonies to work to also running other types of experiments. And so by kind of playing with these engineering ideas on a small scale, they will then begin to apply them on a larger scale over time. Gunpowder is innovated in China around the year 850. You'll hopefully remember that it was some Taoists who created it or invented gunpowder after observing the properties of saltpeter in the earth. Originally, gunpowder, however, was not used as a weapon. It was used more for things like fireworks and used for ceremony. But over time, it's really kind of in the 12 and 1300s, they utilize it for weaponry. The Tang Dynasty is credited with the earliest smallpox vaccines, which is very incredible to think that people understood immunology at this time period. How they would administer the smallpox vaccine, however, is a little bit gross. They would do things such as take the scabs of smallpox victims and dilute them in solutions that people would either drink or sniff. Sometimes they would use proximity vaccine as well to put people in somewhat close proximity with infected people to help them gain some sort of immunization. China also developed printing, as we've mentioned before. So under the Tang Dynasty, they developed block printing. And block printing is essentially each page of whatever book you're printing has to be carved individually into a block, and then the paper is and ink is run through it. The Song Dynasty invents movable type, which means that you make small blocks of many different characters in this case, or it would be letters if you were making them today, that you can then interchange based on the page. What's interesting is that block printing stays more popular in China because it actually took less time to carve each page than it did to try to keep the hundreds and hundreds of Chinese character blocks organized and to move them out. But most other societies will adopt the movable type because it makes more sense for their alphabets. The Chinese invent the spinning wheel, which is very important for the creation of fabric and textiles. They also expand a lot of agricultural and irrigation techniques, which will be important for the last point I bring up. I already mentioned porcelain. They do attempt paper money and certain sailing technologies, which we'll bring up in a different context later. And I also want to talk about champa. So champa is a form of rice that comes out of Vietnam that the Chinese adopt and help develop even further, specifically through some of the flooding techniques that are used in rice paddy fields. So champa is a rice that is bred in Vietnam that's improved in China, which is a fast ripening rice, meaning that rather than only have 1 or 2 yields of that crop per year, you can have even like 2 or 3 times that amount, which means that there is more food flooding into China and other parts of East Asia, which leads to a serious population boom. So by the year 1200, China has over 115 million people, and the world population at this point is 420 million people. Right? So we're talking about a quarter of the world's population, which China is almost always throughout history about a quarter of the world's population, which will help us continuously understand why China is so dominant in world history. Right? They just have that population there. So not only do you see a general population boom, but we start to see more people concentrated in cities, right? So the rise of more urbanization. So cities like Hangzhou and Chennai become super populated, and we'll do a project that explores the concepts of these cities later. Also, as I mentioned before, because of the Southern Song era, right, where more of the powerful people are moving south, we start to see more Southern Chinese culture become really popular. So rice is grown in the south and tea is more popularly grown in the south. And so they're going to move these goods more to the north, which is going to help to spread some of these cultural ideas and to help to connect northern Chinese culture and southern Chinese culture in a way that creates more of a sense of nationalism. All right, I'm going to pause there for now, and we will review and expand this in class.